What would you do if you woke up one morning and found your backyard drowning in raw sewage? For Jack Mitchell, that nightmare became his reality on a quiet Tuesday morning. The moment he stepped outside, he nearly lost his footing as his boots sank into a bubbling brown puddle. The stench hit him like a punch to the gut, thick, overwhelming, and unmistakable. His beautiful garden, the one he had spent 3 years perfecting, was now buried under filth. His workshop, where he handcrafted furniture, was ruined, his tools sitting in a pool of contaminated sludge. Jack's stomach twisted in horror as he scanned his property, searching for the source of the disaster. The sewage wasn't just leaking, it was gushing from somewhere uphill, flowing straight into his yard. His dog, Rusty, whimpered at the door, refusing to step outside. This wasn't just a plumbing issue, this was a full-scale environmental catastrophe. Jack immediately called the Maple Grove Estates HOA emergency line. It took 20 minutes on hold before a familiar voice answered, laced with irritation. "Mr. Mitchell, I'm extremely busy today. What seems to be the problem?" Karen Thompson, the HOA president, sounded annoyed before he even spoke. Jack gritted his teeth, forcing himself to stay calm. "Karen, my entire yard is flooded with raw sewage. It's coming from somewhere uphill. This is a serious health hazard." Karen let out a long sigh, as if he had just complained about a mailbox being slightly crooked instead of his home being turned into a biohazard zone. "We authorized some minor plumbing adjustments yesterday. It's probably just a temporary side effect." Jack clenched his jaw. "Temporary? Karen, my yard is completely underwater. My garden is dead. My workshop is destroyed. The smell is coming through my windows. You need to send someone out immediately." Karen's tone shifted, her words slow and patronizing. "Mr. Mitchell, perhaps you should have considered potential drainage issues before building so close to the community line. Or, before buying in Maple Grove at all." The line went silent. Jack felt his grip on the phone tighten. He knew exactly what she meant. Since moving in 3 years ago, Karen and her group of HOA loyalists had made it clear that he didn't belong. His house wasn't brand new with an expensive modern design, his truck wasn't a sleek luxury SUV, and worst of all, he actually worked with his hands for a living. Jack exhaled sharply, his patience wearing thin. "So you're telling me I have to live like this for a week? Well, unless you can magically fix the plumbing yourself, I suppose you'll have to be patient." The line went dead. Jack stood there, phone still pressed against his ear, heart pounding. The HOA had just dumped sewage into his yard and laughed in his face. But they had no idea who they were dealing with. If this was a fight they wanted, they had just started a war. Jack barely slept that night. No matter how tightly he sealed the windows, the nauseating stench of sewage seeped into his home, clinging to the walls, his clothes, even his skin. Rusty whined at the door, refusing to step outside. By morning, Jack's head throbbed from the fumes, his throat raw from breathing in the contaminated air. But he wasn't just disgusted, he was furious. The HOA had done this, and they were pretending it didn't exist. Determined to find out exactly what was happening, Jack pulled on his boots and followed the flow of sewage uphill to its source. It didn't take long before he found it, a freshly installed pipe, partially hidden behind the bushes on HOA common ground. The pipe wasn't leaking, it was actively spewing waste, sending a slow but steady river of filth directly onto his property. His stomach churned at the sight, but not just from the smell. This wasn't an accident. Someone had done this on purpose. As he pulled out his phone to snap pictures, movement caught his eye. Rick Wilkins, the HOA treasurer, was walking his perfectly groomed poodle along the sidewalk. Jack called out to him. "Rick! You need to see this." Rick hesitated, his gaze flicking toward the pipe, then back to Jack. He pretended not to hear and kept walking. Jack's patience was gone. "Rick, This pipe is dumping sewage onto my land. The HOA installed this, didn't they? Rick finally stopped, standing at a careful distance from the mess. He adjusted his expensive tie, his expression carefully blank. I have no idea what you're talking about. Must be a county issue. Jack narrowed his eyes. Karen told me yesterday that the HOA authorized plumbing work. Rick's face twitched ever so slightly. I'm afraid she misspoke. If you have a complaint, take it up with the county. He turned sharply, tugging his dog away like Jack was the one covered in sewage. Jack stood there, fists clenched. They were lying straight to his face. By the time he returned home, the smell had somehow gotten worse. His yard was beginning to resemble a swamp, and the neighbors on either side had started calling to complain, not to the HOA, but to Jack himself. Karen had already spread the lie that it was Jack's own septic system that failed. That evening, Jack made his next move. He hired a professional plumber, Mike Alvarez, a guy recommended by a friend. When Mike arrived in his beat-up work truck, he took one look at Jack's yard and let out a low whistle. Holy hell. I've seen bad backups, but this? This is intentional. Jack led him to the hidden pipe uphill, explaining everything. Mike's face darkened. I don't know what kind of shady stuff your HOA is pulling, but I'll find out. For hours, Mike worked tirelessly, using specialized cameras and testing kits, tracking the flow of the waste beneath the ground. As the sun started setting, sweat dripped from his forehead as he called Jack over. Look at this. On his camera screen, clear as day, was a brand new pipeline, one that didn't match any of the old sewer maps for the neighborhood. Mike pointed to the evidence. Someone installed this recently. This pipe shouldn't exist. And look where it leads. Jack's stomach turned cold as he followed the line. It wasn't connected to the main sewer like it should have been. Instead, it was diverting sewage from the HOA's new luxury spa, dumping it straight into Jack's yard. Mike shook his head in disbelief. This wasn't a mistake. They did this to save money. Hooking this up properly would have cost them at least 50 grand. Instead, they just dumped it on you. Jack exhaled sharply, rage burning in his chest. Can you put all of this in a report? Something official? Mike nodded. I'll document everything. Photos, timestamps, even soil tests. This is illegal as hell. Jack shook his hand, gripping it firmly. Send me everything. As Mike packed up his tools, he gave Jack a warning. Be careful, man. These HOA types? They play dirty. My cousin lost his house fighting one in Redwood Hills. Jack didn't need the warning. He already knew exactly how dirty Karen played. The next morning, Jack marched straight to the HOA office, armed with Mike's report. He stormed past Karen's assistant, slamming the papers onto the desk. This is proof the HOA illegally diverted sewage onto my land. Meg, Karen's assistant, barely looked up from her screen. Mrs. Thompson only sees people by appointment. Jack gritted his teeth. This is an emergency. Meg finally glanced at the report, then, without hesitation, fed the pages straight into the office shredder. Jack's blood boiled. He could see Karen through the glass door, reclining in her chair, smirking as she turned her back to him. The next words out of Meg's mouth nearly made him lose control. You'll need to email your concerns to the appropriate committee. Jack took a slow breath, steadying himself. Losing his temper now wouldn't help. Instead, he turned and walked out, but not before taking a long, careful look at the office layout. That night, as Jack sat at his kitchen table, staring at the mound of useless paperwork in front of him, his phone pinged. A new email from the HOA. He opened it, and his jaw dropped. The HOA had accidentally included all residents in an internal email chain. And in it, clear as day, was a message from Karen herself. The Mitchell situation is under control. We'll continue denying everything until he gives up. These working-class types can't afford lawyers anyway. Once he's desperate enough to sell, Thompson Development will move forward with the cul-de-sac expansion. Jack felt his hands shake as he read the words again. They weren't just ignoring the problem. They had done this deliberately, to force him out, take his land, and sell it for profit. Jack leaned back in his chair, breathing deeply. They thought he was powerless. They thought he'd roll over and take it. They had no idea who they were dealing with. Jack sat in the dim glow of his kitchen, staring at the email. His hands tightened into fists, the words seared into his mind. They thought he couldn't fight back. They thought he couldn't afford to. The audacity of it made his skin burn. They weren't just cutting corners or making careless mistakes, they were deliberately ruining people's lives for profit. He clenched his jaw and exhaled slowly. If Karen Thompson wanted a war, she had just declared it. By morning, he had a plan. He couldn't fight this alone. He needed allies. Jack started with the few neighbors who had given him sympathetic looks at the last HOA meeting. He knocked on doors, coffee in hand, offering nothing but the truth. It didn't take long for the stories to pour out. Sarah Bennett, who used a wheelchair, told him how Karen's board had denied her ramp request 3 times, claiming it would disrupt neighborhood aesthetics. She had finally installed it herself, at a cost of $7,000, only for the HOA to fine her every month until she gave up and removed it. Jason Lee showed him letters demanding he dismantle his solar panels, despite state law protecting them. The HOA had ignored his appeals and slapped him with $500 a day fines until he couldn't afford to fight anymore. Michael Carter, a quiet man with tired eyes, said his parents had lost their home to a mandatory improvement fee that the HOA had voted on behind closed doors. The money went straight to Karen's husband's construction company. Jack felt his blood boil as he listened. He had been so focused on his own battle that he hadn't realized just how deep the corruption went. By the end of the day, they had formed a group, Maple Grove Homeowners for Fair Treatment. Jack compiled every shred of evidence they had gathered into a report and sent it to every agency he could think of: the State Housing Board, the Environmental Protection Office, the County Health Department. But the responses were slow and frustrating. "We'll review your case within 90 days. Due to staffing shortages, an inspector will be available next month. We advise resolving this matter through your HOA's internal appeals process." Jack nearly threw his phone across the room. The system was too slow. By the time anyone took action, Karen would have already forced him out, buried the evidence, and sold his land. And then, as if she could smell his frustration, Karen delivered her next blow. A certified letter from the HOA arrived that afternoon. Notice of violation, unsightly yard conditions. Jack ripped it open, scanning the absurd accusations. The HOA was fining him $100 per day until he removed the hazardous waste from his yard. The very same sewage they had dumped there. Jack laughed. A bitter, humorless sound. They weren't even trying to hide their intentions anymore. That night, he spotted Karen and Rick walking along his property line with a surveyor. The man pointed at different areas, marking the ground with orange stakes. Jack's stomach turned. He stormed outside, his voice sharp. "What the hell do you think you're doing?" Karen barely turned, smiling like a predator enjoying the moment before the kill. "Oh, Jack," she sighed, mocking concern. "It's just a routine survey." Rick smirked. "We're preparing for possible future development." Jack took a step forward. "My property is not for sale." Karen's smile widened. "Not yet." And just like that, he understood. They were laying the groundwork to take his home. Once the fines piled up high enough, they'd hit him with legal action, forced foreclosure, and take it for pennies on the dollar. That night, Jack didn't sleep. Instead, he pulled out every document, every email, every photo he had collected. If the system wouldn't move fast enough, he would. By dawn, he had a plan. But it wouldn't just be about stopping Karen. It would be about taking everything from her. Jack had spent his life solving problems with his hands. He built things. Fixed things. When something broke, he found a way to make it stronger than before. That's how he had always operated. But this? This wasn't something he could repair. This was something he had to destroy. The HOA had stolen his home's safety. They had tried to drown him in sewage and bury him under legal fees. But Karen Thompson and her people had one fatal weakness: they believed they were untouchable. They assumed he was just another helpless homeowner who would crumble under pressure. They were about to find out just how wrong they were. Jack picked up the phone and called his cousin, Ryan Mitchell. Ryan ran Mitchell Concrete, a family business that had been around for 3 generations. "I'm guessing this isn't a social call," Ryan said the second he answered. Jack exhaled slowly. "I need a favor. And a truck." There was a long pause before Ryan sighed. "Tell me what those HOA bastards did now." Jack laid it all out. The sewage. The lies. The fines. The survey markers that meant they were preparing to steal his land. Ryan let out a low whistle. "Damn, Jack. I'd say they've earned what's coming. What's the plan?" Jack leaned forward, gripping the phone tighter. "The HOA office is closing for renovations next week. No security. No employees. No witnesses." Ryan was quiet for a moment. "You want me to pour concrete into their office?" Jack almost said yes. Almost told Ryan to fill the entire damn building from floor to ceiling, encasing every smug piece of Karen's world in solid stone. But as satisfying as that would be, it wasn't the right move. "I need something better," Jack said. "Something that makes a statement, but can't get traced back to us." Ryan hummed in thought. "What about industrial-grade expanding foam?" Jack frowned. "Like insulation?" "No," Ryan said, a grin in his voice. "This stuff looks and hardens just like concrete. It expands, fills every crack, and sets solid as rock. But here's the kicker: it can be removed with the right dissolving agent. No permanent damage, no destruction charges." Jack felt a slow smile spread across his face. "How fast does it set?" 15 minutes, Ryan said. "Less if we pump enough in." It was perfect. The HOA office would be a tomb. By the time anyone realized what had happened, it would be too late to do anything but watch in horror. Jack spent the next 3 days planning every detail. He watched security cameras, noting which were real and which were just for show. He memorized the HOA office layout, the lock type on the back door, even the cleaning crew schedule. The night before the operation, he called Ryan again. "Tomorrow night. 2 a.m. Ryan chuckled. "I'll bring the foam." When the time came, Jack dressed in dark clothes, pulled on gloves, and met Ryan 2 blocks from the HOA office. Ryan had covered his company logo with fake magnetic signs reading County Maintenance. "Last chance to back out," Ryan muttered as they stepped out of the truck. Jack smirked. "Not a chance." Moving fast, they picked the side door lock, a simple 2-pin mechanism Jack had practiced on a dozen times. Within seconds, they were inside. The office smelled of fresh paint and fake lavender. Jack could almost hear Karen's smug voice in his head. They worked quickly. Ryan ran the hose from the truck, feeding it through the mail slot. The thick, gray expanding foam poured in, covering the floors, climbing up Karen's desk, filling every drawer, every file cabinet, every crack. Jack grabbed the hose, directing it toward the most important areas, the filing cabinets with years of fraudulent HOA records, the laptop Karen always used, the expensive leather chair she refused to let anyone else sit in. It was beautiful. Ryan checked his watch. 5 minutes left before it sets. Jack looked around, then got an idea. He pressed his gloved hands deep into the half-set foam on Karen's desk, leaving behind a perfect imprint. A message. Ryan chuckled. Damn. That's cold. Jack grinned. She deserves worse. As they packed up, Mrs. Rodriguez, the old widow from 2 houses down, peeked through her window. For a moment, Jack's stomach dropped. But then, she nodded. Slowly. Jack tipped his head in silent acknowledgement. Then they were gone, the truck rolling away into the night, leaving behind nothing but a sealed tomb of Karen's corruption. And by morning, all hell would break loose. Jack sipped his coffee as the morning sun rose over Maple Grove Estates, watching from his porch as the chaos unfolded. Karen Thompson had arrived at the HOA office at exactly 8:30 a.m., dressed in her usual expensive suit, ready to oversee the final renovations. She had expected a freshly polished space, a gleaming office fit for a queen. Instead, she found a solid mass of hardened foam blocking the entrance. From his hidden cameras, Jack had captured it all, Karen jamming her key into the lock, struggling, then stepping back as realization dawned on her face. The moment she pushed the door open and saw her office completely entombed, she let out a shriek that could probably be heard across the neighborhood. Mitchell, she screamed, spinning wildly, already knowing who was responsible. But there was nothing she could do. Jack sat back, enjoying the scene like it was a movie. The foam had done its job. The entire office, Karen's precious files, her luxurious leather chair, her carefully curated kingdom, was completely sealed away under an impenetrable layer. And then, just as she was calling the police, the real disaster struck, for her, at least. Law enforcement arrived, but they weren't there for the foam. Daniel Wright, the investigator from the district attorney's office, stepped out of a government car, flanked by officers. Mrs. Thompson, we have a warrant to search your home and seize all HOA financial records. Jack could hear her panicked spluttering from across the street. Rick Wilkins, the HOA treasurer, must have sensed what was coming, because he tried to make a run for it, only to be tackled to the ground by 2 officers. And just like that, the reign of Karen Thompson came crashing down. By noon, news vans lined the street, reporters crowding around as officers carried out boxes of financial records, fraudulent contracts, and forged documents. Karen's web of corruption was bigger than anyone had realized. She had been embezzling HOA funds for years, falsifying environmental reports, and illegally diverting sewage to save money on construction costs, all while bullying homeowners into silence. When a reporter asked Jack if he had anything to say, he just smiled. I'm not here to talk about concrete. I'm here to talk about justice. Karen and Rick were arrested that day. The remaining board members were voted out in disgrace. Sarah Bennett became the new HOA president, and her wheelchair ramp was approved that same afternoon. Months later, Jack's garden flourished once more, the smell of sewage long gone. He received a package in the mail, a small chunk of the hardened foam, mounted like a trophy, with a note from Daniel Wright. Sometimes the hardest problems need the strongest solutions. Jack chuckled, setting it on his desk. The HOA still existed, but now it protected homeowners instead of bullying them. As for Jack, he finally had his peace back, his land, his workshop, his home. As he and Ryan sat on the porch, admiring the new vegetable garden, Ryan smirked. So, was it worth it? Jack clinked his lemonade glass against his cousin's. Revenge, he said, taking a sip, is a dish best served solid. Have you ever felt powerless against HOA, or Karen, rules? Share your experiences below, let's see who had it worse.